May 16 was introduced into the commemorative calendar of Sinti and Roma communities in Europe only in recent years. The date is rooted in an eyewitness account describing how Roma prisoners in a so-called Zigeunerlager at Auschwitz-Birkenau resisted the first attempt to liquidate the camp. Although the Auschwitz-Birkenau Memorial Museum questioned the historical accuracy of the event in 2019 in a research publication, citing the lack of multiple testimonies and the absence of archival evidence, the symbolic power of May 16 has continued to grow. For many Roma and Sinti, the day transcends the specifics of that one historical moment. It has become a powerful symbol of collective resistance against anti-Gypsyism, past and present.
We've done research at ERIAC in 2019, which was actually a response to the Auschwitz Museum's declaration that the uprising in Auschwitz didn't happen, or maybe it happened differently or another date. We created a research, invited 12 scholars from different countries and asked them to help us understand resistance as a more complex phenomenon. And it is through this research that we found many different ways that are often much more subtle, and they're also sometimes individual, and sometimes even counterintuitive. One example that comes to mind for me is Alfreda Markowska, Noncia, a Polish Romani woman, who is right there, actually. Bibi Noncia is there with us. So Bibi Noncia was a Roma woman from Poland who, in just insane ways, straight from like Hollywood-style action movies, saved Roma, Jewish, and Polish children and passed them on to families, and some of them she raised by herself. I mean, her story and the anecdotes of her life are just completely unbelievable. So we started to understand that loving, that caring, that mothering is a form of resistance. Another example, of course, is also through culture. And again, going back to Cheja Stojka and thinking of how brave she was to translate the deep trauma of her experiences into works of art, into poetry, and into text. And it is thanks to these testimonies, both visual and textual, that eventually we managed to have, a gradual recognition of Roma Holocaust and German responsibility and, collaborating states' responsibility for it.
Let us first start with the discussion how it is in Germany. You mentioned this independent commission. We published a report in 2021, and the report was discussed in the Bundestag in 2023. All the democratic parties were unified in this resolution, and in the debate there were 3 speakers of the Conservative Party, and all the 3 speakers mentioned that they support this resolution, but also all the 3 speakers mentioned that they don't support only the idea of institutional racism. They said something like this doesn't exist, and they definitely do not undersign this concept. So that's the debate, or the level of debate where we are at least in Germany at the moment. From my perspective, my main focus at the moment is police racism. And I think it's really interesting in police racism, mainly people are focusing on racial profiling on a street level, right? There's controls, those are racialized, people of color are controlled more than others, but that's what people mostly think about. And you can imagine this being due to individual racism by certain police people, or you can also conceptualize this because specific spaces in the city which are already racialized in the knowledge become danger zones and get policed more and get controlled more. So already in the racial profiling you have those 2 different levels, from the individual racism to the really institutionalized, conceptualized level. And then what is more specific to anti-Gypsyism is that it's not only this day-to-day control racial profiling, but you have those categories, those databases, those papers that police are producing, and that are producing a specific knowledge that leads to specific police words, that police is this group different from others. And that is something that a bit with the terminology clan criminalität, a bit this exists also towards other groups, but it has this long history in policing Sinti and Roma in Germany. And there's still experts that are writing like ethnological papers about Sinti or Roma in police journals and try to explain why those people are more criminal or why they are criminal in this or that regard. And they argue with ethnological work and they cite ethnological literature that also Gypsy Law Society would cite. So it's the same database they're even talking about. This is one other level of this. And of course, those experts, they shape the way Roma and Sinti are policed. They shape the way those concepts are established. And then you have to think of all the databases that existed. I mean, the Auschwitz lager was, most of the people that are deported there were deported by the German police at the time. And they were deported on the basis of 23,000 Gutachten.
Like records?
Records, like scientific, racial hygiene Gutachten that were made upon that, on their degree of racial belonging to this group or not. And those Gutachten, they date back to the police work from 1899 even, where the foundation of this work was laid, but they were used continuously in the Bundesrepublik after the war as well. So you have a concept, and I think if you would be able to really look at all the police databases, you would still find traces of those old, even before the war, police databases that are still ingrained in today's concepts. Of course, today's concept, I don't believe that today in German police they are still having a large database of all the people, and they are not trying to do. But what they have is racialized ideas of specific crimes, and those specific crimes are like a code for Roma.
And I think it's important to understand that anti-Gypsyism is a very complex phenomenon. And it has this institutional layer or this institutional manifestation, but it's also interpersonal and intrapersonal. That means that anti-Gypsyism manifests itself not only through institutions, the power relations and the power structures, but also through contact between people of Roma and non-Roma. And this intrapersonal aspect also refers to the biases, to the prejudices, sometimes even well-intended kind of allyship, which still may continue to reproduce stereotypical, romanticized, fetishized, or very stigmatizing images and discourses about Roma. And we can totally trace, how arts and culture, how the academia and how institutions have created and reproduced this stigma and these images. And of course, this projects on Roma very much, because if we consider these three layers, institutional, interpersonal and intrapersonal layer, and we consider also the intersectionality and multiple discrimination. So if you're a Roma person coming from a poor background, and you happen to be a woman, and on top of that maybe you happen to have some type of a disability, or you're in an age group that's more likely to be discriminated in general, all this adds multiple layers of experience. And unfortunately, these different manifestations or types of anti-Gypsyism are the daily bread of all Roma, really. There is, I think, not one Roma person that would not experience in one way or another anti-Gypsyism, even if they try to hide their identity or they blend in, or they are those halfies, somewhere in between. They can still experience the self-stigmatization, the shame, and the hiding of identity actually comes from that. Yeah. Then on the other hand, of course, we have the most dramatic examples of really destruction of lives through anti-Gypsyism. The first example that comes to mind is what just happened recently in Zaharna Fabrika in Bulgaria, where the Bulgarian state destroyed an entire Roma neighborhood unlawfully, because the court and the European court also said this is absolutely unacceptable. They still destroyed the livelihood of decades of lives. The people couldn't even go into their houses and take their belongings. The bulldozers just came and destroyed their lives. And this happened like a couple of weeks ago, right? So I think that we really need to understand and appreciate the forces that are against all Roma people, whether, different strata of society, depending on, disregarding whether you live in a community or they're integrated into a big city, there's still such strong forces of anti-Gypsyism in there that it affects very many things. Attitudes, ideologies, and behaviors that led to the darkest chapter of European history during the World War II, they haven't disappeared. They're still there. They have morphed, they evolved, they mutated into something different, and there are different phenomena such as I can think of AI and the technological revolution, how that affects also and influences how anti-Gypsyism is experienced by people. But it really is quite scary, and it's even more so if we think of, where we are today in German politics, in Polish politics, Hungarian politics, the rise of far-right, populism, nationalism. All these things sound pretty scary from a Roma perspective or a minority perspective in general.
The material I'm kind of researching slowly is from 1850, 52, 55, so the time when the Swiss nation state was founded, more or less. Around France and Germany, like the neighboring areas were not going into kind of a nation per se yet, but so from the side of the Swiss nation state, there came up this need to kind of know where people are, how they move, to settle people down more or less. And it overlapped with the invention of photography. So people understood very fast that by kind of deploying photography for police kind of reasons, you can kind of capture people literally. And that was the attempt. So people who moved between Switzerland, France, and Germany were photographed by force, like they were imprisoned, photographed, so that they could not move anymore. They really wanted people to have a settled life, so that was the main focus, and this main focus then overlapped with ethnic cleansing. And of course this question comes up very fast: how do you do that without reproducing the violent gaze, the police gaze, but still kind of speaking about it, or kind of putting it into kind of this question of what is actually memory, how does memory function as a collective thing, but also on a personal level, and how do you kind of navigate these different spaces, especially when a lot of kind of what should be remembered is about being kind of being deleted or disappeared or just taken over by what is there by the state. And then I started spending time in the archive, and I also started to read police letters. And then I realized that from these police letters, they started to build up lists with categories. And these categories would expand and expand and expand. So you could really see how people were also racialized and made into something by these lists. But it was introduced with in the very moment that the modern nation state was founded, in this case. And then I also searched for this material in Karlsruhe. That's something I still hope I can follow up at some point. And I would find material. I knew they have material. And it took long to search because I didn't think you would have to use the Z word to actually find that material. So it was an archivist from a local archive that at some point pointed this out to me. I think we have to look with this search term. So then I was also like, wow, it's also about the archives, right? Until today, maybe no one worked on this archive to restructure it or to just ask this question, why is this keywording? And then also a million times you find it in there. It's like, so there's many, many levels. And so in the performance, each time I show it, I rework it, I redo it. I try to highlight another aspect, because the question is always like, how do you not just expose the material, repeat the gaze, but how do you kind of maybe leave it in a way, in a bit of a disappointing space of also not feeding this desire to, to get it, and also to get the full thing, but to rather navigate it and rather ask these questions, and maybe also put it in relation to a space, to bodies, to the body's presence, or my own one in that moment, but also the bodies of the spectators, of where it's taking place. So all these things can be brought into the space, so to say.
I just remembered another Roma scholar, friend of ours, who has been researching slavery in Romania, Adriani Fortuna, and when I had a discussion with him about each other's research, he came with this idea that in all of your research and art is presented that this hatred, what we now name as Antigypsyism, was always here and it continues to be here, and he can see it from those archives, but he is now researching. So this wasn't just during the Second World War. This wasn't just in the end of the 19th century, but for example, if we go to the east, more to the east, and we look at that period of time, that 500 years of slavery, it was there too.
I think it's important for a resistance regarding institutional anti-Gypsyism. It's important to really understand it as something institutional. And that would be a bit my hint, at least to today's organizations in Germany, regarding police, for example. They are very often, and of course the police wants that, they're very often doing workshop, teaching the police officers. But that has the idea that it's not an institutional problem, but the problem of individual racist ideologies inside the police people. And my argument would be, no, that's not the core of the problem. The core of the problem is the institutionalized elements where you could take out all the people and change them with new ones, and they would continue the racism because the institutions are like that. So that's why I would say maybe dealing with the people is not the best approach, but that is of course also what the politics want. They always do research on what is the police thinking, the police people thinking about this, that minority. Are they hated? Do they hate them or do they accept them? So that's also the research they pay for, and that's then also the workshops they accept.
Presence of Roma bodies as a tool of resistance is extremely powerful, and I think we don't use it enough. So the assembly, the power of coming together, just also feeling that you're not alone, you're not hopeless in this whole structure of anti-Gypsyism. You're with your brothers and sisters, with your friends and allies, with others who want to fight this injustice with you. And for me, these are the forms that are most powerful and that we have to use more.
Can you maybe speak about something that, like a project, which is called For the Wishful Library? And I started it after I had worked with this kind of archival material since a while. And I felt like this urge to connect it to friends and to like see it also as part of an intersectional kind of question of our time in a way. So I invited people to join for exhibitions where we would kind of create a visual library, like a library that contains not only books, but also movements, songs, videos, interventions. So to also question this thing of who's let's say in the cultural field, like who is getting remembered, who is getting published books, whose books are in the libraries of all these institutions, and why only books. So I felt this was always kind of, there's 3 iterations of the visual library that took place, and I always thought it was so beautiful because then you suddenly have all these kind of conversations also with why would this person feel like, my contribution is let's dance together, or my contribution is this video that relates to kind of personal history or something. And suddenly you have this multi-vocal space that kind of enables to kind of get out of the box maybe somehow also, but also to have other kind of conversations maybe and other encounters.
From the beginning, let's say 15 years ago, I was talking all about stereotypes and individual racism, and now I'm really thinking the thing that has the worst impact is on an institutional and structural level, not the individual is kind of the last level, but not the deciding one. So, and I at the same time think the resistance there is more complicated. So, and we have to understand institutional racism is legal. It is not in most times something that is illegal, but it is created through legal measures that are legal in the states where it happens. So sometimes the protest has to be on the border of being legal or being illegal. I mean, the occupation of this university archive was on paper illegal, but it was, of course, an heroic act. And for me, if I look in recent history, I mean, look at Lety. Lety was a former concentration camp in the Czech Republic for Romani people. And then in the recent years, there was a pig farm. And it started really, the resistance there started with a group of, I don't know, 15 people, 20 people. Yeah. And then they blocked the roads to the pig farm. They tried to interrupt their daily business, but they also did an information tour. I know they toured Germany in 2010 or something, 2012. Mm-hmm. And now the Czech state has bought this pig farm and they're tearing it down, and I think they are even starting to build, but the memorial is not finished. But but it started with really a handful of people who said, no, this has to stop. Mm-hmm. And this is, I mean, of course, you need to have a lot of privileges, you need to have time, resources to be able to do that. I see that, but I think sometimes it needs such things, or they at least have to work together with what we are doing more in the institutions, right? We are creating research and we're getting money from the state and we're using that money, and that is also very important, but we need this corresponding activism that is on the streets.
Inspiring point of an absolutely heroic act of defiance in the face of the most inhumane conditions is just a source of inspiration for all of us. And with time, as the celebration of the uprising or the commemoration of the uprising gained momentum, we also started to recover through oral history, through family archives, but also through research, that we cannot only think of resistance in terms of armed resistance. I mean, you say resistance, you think resistance fighters, you think armed uprising, you think partisans, you think the army. Of course, that's part of the story. So we need to remember that, Roma were part of the partisan structures, they were in the armies, they were doing armed resistance. But the resistance act is much more complex. I think it was Cheja Stojka who said that survival is resistance. Our survival is resistance. And actually, if you consider the long history of anti-Gypsyism, of centuries of mistreatment we've suffered, the fact that we're still here, despite all the efforts of the state and of the populations to annihilate us, the fact that we're still here is because this resistance is our daily bread.